Why do I write? Um, to keep from going insane is the short answer. I mean, it started out. I had never written before, other than like short things here and there, but I'd never really written before until I started a comedy festival. So when I moved out to LA, I started a comedy festival with a friend, a Middle Eastern comedy festival, and we had put out a call for submissions, and nobody submitted. And so we were like, well, we need to have content. So we started writing. I mean, he was a stand-up comedian, so he had that experience of writing jokes and whatnot, but I had never really written anything before. So I started writing out of necessity. And then I found out that I enjoyed it. Well, and I think to this day, I think still enjoy having written more than I enjoy writing. Because it's usually pulling teeth. It's not a every once in a while I'll be blessed with that day that it's just this like free outpouring of inspiration, but it's usually a slow slog uphill. So anyway, so we started writing sketches, and then we wrote a pilot together. We had set out to write this comedy pilot, which ended up being this very overwrought, dramatic, self-conscious. There's a kernel of goodness in there somewhere, and we're going to refine it. We're actually about to start working on it again in February when he comes back in town. But so from there, I realized I had all these stories in my head, and I just had story after story after story, way more probably than I'll ever be able to write. Tangent, you know, a lot of times when you start writing, you're like afraid if you share your idea that somebody's going to steal your idea, and it happens. But I think most writers have more stories than they could ever get out in a lifetime, and so the fear of like a good writer stealing your story is just it's a weird fear that I realized at some point. I was like, if I have all these stories, imagine that people who have done this for a living for their life, how many stories they have. They don't care about my story. I mean, they care, but they don't care to take my story. Interestingly, great and terrifying. Great because it's nice to know that people are responding to what you do, that you're not totally crazy. Terrifying because there's this feeling of now that there's some sort of recognition that you have to live up to it somehow. I was just at Sundance this past week, and there was, and forgive me if I forget his name. I believe his name is Colin O'Grady. He was this guy who trekked 900 miles across Antarctica. And the question, somebody asked him, what's next? Which is always in this business, what's next? And his answer was actually really inspiring. He said, there was a time where I felt like I had to have an answer for that. But there's great creative freedom in not having an answer to that. And so for a while, I felt after that, I was like, oh gosh, now I have to have that next thing. But what happened shortly after that, strangely enough, is I entered this big writing slump where I didn't write. I was like too afraid to start something. So my list of stories just got longer, but I wasn't actually executing anything. So for a period of about a year, probably a year and a half, I didn't write. I mean, I'd start something and I'd kind of set it aside until that idea that I had to have something to follow this up with kind of dissipated. And so now about a few months ago, I finally started writing every day again and just getting into the swing of things. And I'm halfway through the first draft of a feature now that is terrible. I mean, it's a wonderful story, but this first draft is terrible. And it's an animated Christmas film. And the number of expletives that I have in this animated Christmas film for children is staggering. And I'm realizing halfway through, I don't know how to write for kids. But it's nice because I've accepted that it's going to be, this first draft is going to be terrible. No one's ever going to read it, or the second or third, you know, like the first draft is really going to be the fourth or fifth. So I think it's, to long answer to your question, it was great, but it was also this sort of, I had to get my head over the idea that people were watching what I was doing. You know, it's a great thing to be watched, but it's also a terrifying thing to be watched. I don't know if you can see this. That's the picture on my phone. Is it still there? Yeah. So that's me. That's my younger self. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so that's my younger self. And the reason I have that, it sounds really cheesy. I kind of have to remind myself who I report to. And so I've sort of, it's an interesting question because I've sort of been in this conversation with my younger self. And it's a little bit less about the advice I have for my younger self and more about the advice my younger self has for me. And there's a freedom and there's a lack of self-consciousness and there's a creativity and a wildness about childhood that well, a lot of us tend to lose as we get older. And so I think it's really, I'm entering a phase in my life where it's less about what I have to advise my younger self, but more about just listening to what my younger self has to tell me. And that's just big kid. It's been great. It's been a very communicative process. I probably have been less communicative in return than you guys have been. And I have to say, I probably have not taken full advantage of all that you guys have had to offer. But it's a really nice. I mean, the workshops, the weekly advice, all that stuff has been great. And though I'm a silent partner in the relationship, sometimes it still gets absorbed, and it is part of the reason. I have to say that the connection with you guys is part of the reason that I got out of my writing slump, because referring to what I said earlier, there is something to know that there are people who are interested in what you have to say, and there's obligation's not the right word, but there's a desire to continue to merit people's attention. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the attention, and I'm grateful for that. Less the attention and more what the attention inspires in me, which is the desire to continue to merit attention. I have a few goals. One is for my screenplay, Please Don't Die, Roger Berman, to get made, to finish it, and have it in TIFF or Sundance of 2021. Might be a little pushing on the timeline, but that's a desire. I fully intend to write and direct a short this year. I've directed actors quite a bit, but I've never actually directed on camera, and so that's a definite thing that I'm doing. If not two. And then I have two screenplays that I'm working on. Strangely, two Christmas screenplays that I'm working on. And I feel like this is going to be the end of my Christmas. You know how Baz Luhrmann had his like Red Curtain trilogy or whatever it was? I think like this will be the end of my Christmas trilogy. And then I can go on to, I don't know, Easter movies.